We have two absolute all-stars with us tonight. I've known Will and Homa for a couple of years now, and I love soaking in everything they have to share. So Homa and Will are from the Big Questions Institute, and that is the short introduction I'm going to give for them because they have so much to share. And they said, yep, they can go look for bios elsewhere if they so choose. But I'm going to go ahead and give it away to them.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. And good evening or good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. That's kind of the standard Zoom greeting these days. We're really happy to have a little chance to spend some time with you today to talk a little bit about how we're looking at the world in this very complex and kind of chaotic moment that we're in, and to think a little bit about how we might begin to frame our work around this idea of islands of sanity, which comes from the author Margaret Wheatley, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. But we want to set some contexts pretty quickly here. As Paul said, we've got a lot that we want to try to put into this half hour and then leave about 10 minutes at the end for some conversation. And so if you all don't mind, I think we're just going to dive right into it. We kind of operate under the thesis that because of everything that's happening today in this moment, and Homa is going to articulate a lot of what we see as the most important context right now, we really have to begin to redesign, to kind of rethink the experience of school, one that centers on wellness, relevance, justice, sustainability, and that the concept of islands of sanity is really a shift away from school being about me to school being about we, in terms of the larger sense of the collective and of humanity. And there's a Zach Stein quote that we're going to share here in a minute too that articulates that even more kind of clearly and profoundly. So I'm going to turn it over to Homa real quickly, and we'll get started with seeing some of the contexts that we're thinking are important for framing here.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Paul. It is great to join you tonight, or wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in. And if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat, let us know where you're from, what you do, what you're interested in. We love to catch up, and we don't have a chance to introduce everybody, but it is an opportunity to kind of, see the excitement of where we're all coming from. And so, as Will mentioned, we do situate the work that we're doing in fearless inquiry with big questions in this moment that we're living through. And so clearly, the big elephant in the room is COVID. We are all going through grief, modifications, so many changes due to COVID. And it's not just COVID, but a way that's helping us to frame the situation comes from an essay that came out of the very beginning of the pandemic by the writer and activist Arundhati Roy. And if you've heard us talk about anything, you've probably heard us mention this essay because it's been really important in our work. And we want you to think about what it means to you. So she talks about how historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. So this pandemic is not different from those past ones. Consider it like a portal or a gateway that takes us from a world that we've known into the next. And there's a choice in this portal. We can choose to walk through the portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, data banks, dead ideas, dead rivers, and smoky skies behind us. Or here's the choice. We can choose to walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world, and very importantly, ready to fight for it. So we want to challenge you as we think about these islands of sanity, what's next for education, what is so important that we will carry with us through the portal, and what might we choose to leave behind? And so clearly it's not just COVID that is creating the incredibly challenging moment that we are experiencing as educators. We really think of there are at least twin pandemics, and the twin pandemic, the 400-year epidemic of racism, the movement for Black lives, for justice, for all people is truly a global movement. And thanks to young people around the world, this issue that has been around has really come to the surface for more institutions, organizations, and we cannot just focus on one or the other. It really calls on us in every way to acknowledge the movement for justice. And likewise, questions about social and economic justice have come to the surface. Extremes of poverty and wealth only seem to have grown over this period. That we recognize that our democracy seems more fragile than ever before. Indeed, the largest democracies in the world, India, the United States, are not as stable as we had thought even a few years ago. That we are navigating an infodemic that is really like a crisis of information. How do we teach our students to navigate truth from fiction, fake news, so many sources of information as we live these digital lives? And a climate catastrophe that is really, it's here and it is hard to avoid or deny. And while we look out to the whole wide world, all of these are sort of macro concepts. It's also hitting each one of us personally and intimately pretty hard. And so, the idea that there is this sort of increasing national and international mental health crisis reflects the idea that our brains were not built for this much uncertainty. A lot of us just feel overwhelmed and exhausted and like there's no more bandwidth. So how do we keep going amidst all of this? And I almost want to apologize because I'm going really fast and these are heavy and I don't want to make light of them. I want to acknowledge also the incredibly important work that you're all doing. But that the crisis is real and that this challenge, for example, young people are feeling, not only more and more young people with this anxiety, but there are more sources of anxiety. Climate anxiety, for example, is a new source. It's something that is on the majority of young people's minds these days. And that when it comes to teachers, we are also facing a crisis of resignation. Of more than half of teachers in the United States are considering resignation. And for those of us who stay, it lands hard. All of these are landing on us. So another way that we try to make sense of all of this that's happening comes from another brilliant woman of color whose work we turn to, Adrienne Marie Brown, who said, things are not getting worse, but they are getting uncovered. And so what do? We need to hold each other tight. We need to be there for each other and continue to pull back the veil, continue to tell these hard truths. And what feels new is this unveiling. The heaviness is the increasing weight of the truth becoming undeniable as more people believe it. And so we're sort of in the process of this unveiling of so many different processes that are taking place in the world. COVID didn't cause them all, but it's accelerated them. And what's been uncovered about schools is that in many ways, it looks like schools were built for a world that simply no longer exists. And one way that we make sense of it are a lot of great graphics. This cartoon sort of is one example. There is this volatile, uncertain, complex world out there. We might want to keep it out of our schools. We might want to stick to the curriculum that we've always worked with, where there's one clear, correct answer. We go from A to B, and that's it. But at a younger and younger age, our students are opening the door to the world that's out there, and they're saying, why didn't you prepare me for it? I'm not ready for this. So this is part of our responsibility. And we also acknowledge, as I mentioned, we do want to honor and acknowledge the important work that all of you in schools around the world, and it's so exciting to see all the places that you're tuning in from, that schools are important places for children. where they can reach greater heights and create and contribute beautiful and meaningful things for the world. So that is true. And at the same time, we have to be honest about what we are inheriting, that it's not 1919 anymore when it comes to schools, but how many of the structures, how many of the familiar uh, symbols of school, when we think of school, is a carryover from that industrial age, from a time approximately 1919. Maybe not everything you're doing in schools, but a lot is familiar. And not only that it's not 1919 anymore, it's not even 2019 anymore. So much has changed in terms of our responsibilities, in terms of the way we're seeing the world. And so when we step back and we look at this landscape of context and education, we really do, again, being honest, we need to ask which of these is not, at least in some part, a problem of education or the responsibility of education, as well as a solution and an opportunity for education, that our students are potentially the problem solvers, that our schools can do work that is relevant, that is meaningful, that makes a difference. And so that's part of the exciting, I think, opportunity of what we carry with us through the portal. And so we want to kind of put a pin on this, all of this global contextual challenge with this very challenging quote from educator and philosopher Zach Stein. He talks about this task of education today is to confront the almost unimaginable design challenge. We think of this as an epic design challenge, and that is to build an educational system that provides for the recreation of civilization during a world system transition, that provides, that sees our students as civilization builders. If we see our students that way, what changes? In this time where so many structures and systems that we relied on or that we were familiar with seem to be breaking. And this challenge brings us face to face with the importance of education for humanity, not just an education that is about getting our kids into the best possible university or the best, highest paying jobs, but an education that is recognizing these incredible challenges that we have now and the basic questions that structure education as a human endeavor. So we, as the Big Questions Institute, we aren't coming at this epic design challenge with a bunch of answers. We're not the Big Answers Institute. We are asking more questions. And we think the way forward is through inquiry in community. And it really is a position of humility that we will ask questions and we will learn together. And so these are the 9 questions. The book is deliberately a free download. We want as many educators as possible to get a hold of this and just start having conversations. And for us, it's been a year since we released this book. It's been one of the most exciting things to see educators literally all over the world take this and sort of make it their own. And a starting point is asking, what is sacred about schools? It gives us a foundation. And I'm going to turn it over to Will to talk about some of the other questions.
So one of the things that is in our frame is that we have to be willing to tell some honest truths about the systems and structures that we currently work with in schools. And we want to just emphasize again that we're not suggesting that any of this was done with ill intent. We believe that almost everyone in education has children's best interests at heart when they approach this work. But that the reality of it is that there are some things that are dissonant in terms of how we learn and how we do school. And we just want to tease a couple of those out very, very quickly. And the one that I think is most acute is this gap between the ways that we learn in our natural lives, the idea that, learning is maybe the most natural thing that humans do. We do it from the moment that we're born till the moment before we die. It's how we evolve, it's how we grow. And yet we try to make this natural thing happen in this kind of unnatural space called school. And there is some dissonance there, and there are some issues with that when we try to use systems and structures that don't really comport to the way that humans learn in a natural sense. So when we do work with schools and when we engage in these conversations, one of the things that we do first off is we tease out, what is learning? Let's start there, because that is the core of our work. There's no question about that. And one of the things that we ask is, what are the conditions that are required for deep and powerful learning? And we ask this in the context of our own learning, our personal learning experiences. I've been asking this question now for probably 8 or 9 years in places all around the world. Homa and I, since we formed the Big Questions Institute, have been doing the same, working with international schools, independent schools, public schools, everywhere. What are the conditions? And what's really interesting is what people always say in answer to this question when we ask, well, what are the conditions that lead to the type of learning that really sticks, that's really meaningful to us? And people always say, well, it has to be relevant. It has to have a purpose in some way. I have to have some agency. I have to have some freedom to choose to pursue things on my own terms. It requires teachers and mentors and feedback and that type of social interaction. And yet there's some fun to it, there's some enjoyment, even if it's hard fun, and all these other things. And I would bet that if you were thinking about that question before I showed this list, whatever was in your head probably shows up somewhere here. Most people, when they look at this list, and they just go, yeah, that's a pretty good list that describes what it is that is required for people to learn really deeply. But here's what people never say, and I think this is as interesting, and if not more interesting, than the first list. When we ask, what are the conditions for deep and powerful learning to happen? People never say, well, I like it when I'm sitting in a row, surrounded by people my own age, given a 40-minute time frame or an 80-minute time frame to learn one thing in particular. And when I'm motivated by someone grading it, so that, you know what I'm saying, right? The fact is that in many schools, if not most schools, we are creating conditions that do not comport with the ways in which people actually learn. And again, I'm not saying there's any ill intent here. These are legacy practices and systems that have been, carried down now for hundreds of years. And they were structured at a time when information and knowledge and teachers and technologies were scarce. And we had to create certain efficiencies in order for learning to happen in this kind of unnatural place. But now the world is very, very different. And your children, their students, as well as probably yourselves, are learning in your own lives more on the left-hand side of this slide. And when kids leave us from school, they will live, if they're going to thrive, they will live on the left-hand side of this slide more often than not. And so while most schools are trying to get there, it's really hard. And one of the reasons it's really hard is, again, because of some of these structures that we have. So one of the questions that we ask is, why do we do these particular things, right? And we are very, very specific about saying we do not want to go back to the normals that we have set up in schools, because normal wasn't that great to begin with. I mean, if we're going to be honest again, then I think we have to admit that in many ways, the challenges that we face today are because the normals that we have been living, not just in school, but in our institutions, in our societies, in our frameworks. And that when we begin to interrogate normal in schools, it's a pretty eye-opening experience. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why do we do those things? So we've compiled this list from our own experience. Homa and I are both parents. We've watched our kids go through school. We obviously went through school. We talked to teachers and students on a regular basis. They gave us some of these ideas for normals, but if we're going to be honest, normal in school right now is a curriculum that's forgotten pretty much as soon as the test is over. And it's about kids who want to learn how to get a good grade over learning anything else pretty much. And I can say that's true for my children. It's this kind of unnatural segregation by age or chunks of time or disciplines. It really is about still primarily white colonialist curriculum that's about male explorers, scientists, authors, and histories, and these others, right? And again, I think, you know, while all of these may not apply to your context, I think most people look at this and kind of go, yeah, I mean, that's happening. That's really what's going on in the schools that we have built and the systems that we have created. And it begs the question, why do we want to go back to that? Why do we want to return to a normal where these are basically the cornerstones of the experience that kids have in school? And by the way, we know that this does not have great results when we choose normal. A great book that came out a few years ago by a friend of ours, David Gleason, At What Cost, went, and this is going to be a 30-second synopsis of what is a very powerful argument, went to all sorts of international independent schools, high-performing public schools, and said, he's a psychologist, and he said, you know, I'm having kids come and present with anxiety and depression and suicidal tendencies. And a lot of that seems to be coming from what's happening at school. You know, why do you think that's happening? And most schools were very honest about it. They said, well, it's because we make everything about grades. It's because we have this narrow path that we put them on. It's because we sleep deprive them and make them come to school at 7:30 and a whole bunch of other things. And he said to them, okay, so if you acknowledge that there are these systems or these expectations that are leading kids to these feelings of anxiety and depression, what if you stopped doing them? What if you just said, no, we're not going to do those things any longer? And the very honest response that he got from many of the schools was along the lines of, well, you know what? If we stopped doing those things, we would lose our reputation. We wouldn't be living up to the expectations that are being set for us. And David calls this the bind, where our commitments to kids are in many cases cross purposes with our commitments to ourselves. And that we have to get to the point where we can interrogate that and really think about that. So, you know, it is this idea that so much of our work in schools is trying to do the wrong thing right, again, with the best intention. But yet the righter we are at doing the wrong thing, the wronger we get. And I think now, even before COVID, it's been showing up in terms of the stress levels and the really unwellness of not just our students, but our teachers. And now some schools are beginning to understand that. And they're saying, you know what, we have to stop doing some of the things that we've been doing in the past. We have to actually listen to kids who may raise their hands virtually or whatever and say, I need a mental health day. I remember when I was a teacher for 22 years, I remember there were days when I said, you know what, I'm calling in today. I just need a mental health day. I just need to get away. Well, kids are now saying, we need to have some mental health days. We need to have days where we can just kind of not show up because it's really heavy for a lot of kids right now. And so you see that Harvard and others now are reducing the emphasis on SATs, on standardized tests, not just because of the wellness issue, but because of inequity issues as well. And so there is some movement and some change around how we begin to rethink the experience of school with an emphasis on wellness, an emphasis on relevance and justice and sustainability. But these conversations are just getting started. And if there is a silver lining in COVID, if there is some good news, it has accelerated those. More people are kind of standing up and going, you know what, we need to talk about this now. We need to really talk about what's been uncovered over the last couple of years. Now, this Islands of Sanity idea, we're finally here, right? Comes from a book by Margaret Wheatley, who's one of our favorite authors, who's someone who just is just brilliant in thinking about how to kind of navigate this world, even before COVID. And she wrote a book called Who Do We Choose to Be? And it does ask this question, what is the choice? It's like that portal question. Who do we choose to be right now? Facing reality, claiming leadership, and restoring sanity. And in there, she asked this question, who do you choose to be for this time? Are you willing to use whatever power and influence you have to create islands of sanity that evoke and evoke and rely on our best human qualities to create, relate, and persevere? Will you consciously and bravely choose to reclaim leadership as a noble profession that creates possibility and humanness in the midst of increasing fear and turmoil. And we love that. I mean, and that resonates so deeply with what we're seeing and the questions that we're asking. And the first question that we ask in almost every professional learning engagement that we do, every relationship that we have with schools, we articulate, well, what is it that's really sacred to us? What are those things that are most important to us? And again, if we had the time to do that tonight, we would, but I almost guarantee you, we have done this hundreds of times, and every single time, these are the types of answers that we get. They are about creating safe spaces. They are about relationships between teachers and students. They are about support and voice and mindfulness and all the things that you see here. Never, when we ask the question, what is sacred in schools? Like, what are the things that we hope sustains in schools over the next 10, 20, 30 years? Never do we get answers that say, oh, curriculum, that's really sacred, or assessment, grading. A lot of those normals that we've articulated, in fact, none of them show up here. None of them are really sacred. And so that really is what this idea of islands of sanity is all about. It's how do we create these spaces? And as she puts it, how do we find ways to make a difference with the realization that the level of scale and the work that's possible right now is contained? I mean, there is so much going on right now. We're not going to solve all of these problems in a short period of time. We're just not. This is going to take a long time for us to work through, if we work through it, if we're honest about it. So how do we create spaces where people can remember what it's like to be a good human being? How can we create classroom spaces, in this context at least, where students and teachers can find a sense of connection, a sense of being a human with one another, a sense of the goodness and all those aspects of humanity that are so important to us? And so it might look like this. We may be able to create these islands of sanity if we think about how can we expand agency, real agency, so that kids can pursue learning on their own terms, and they can really own it in ways that many times schools doesn't allow them to have that choice. How can we grade less and test less? Do we really need all of those assessments? Do we really need to assess at all? That's one of the questions that we've been exploring in some of our workshops. How do we talk less and listen more? Can we build spaces where kids can just talk about who they are and what they're experiencing, and teachers to do that as well, an advisory for teachers, to just have space and time to reflect? Can we play more? Because all of the research shows that play is such an important part of learning, and all of these other things, right? Can we create in our schools places where these types of things are really at the center, and then in doing so, wrap or build an education for humanity, which is really what is needed right now? All of those challenges that we face, some of them existential, some of them really scary. But can we create can we design this epic design challenge, a different experience of school that really serves this need for an education for humanity, an education for the future in ways that we've never had to think about it before, but that we have to confront in this particular moment? So I'm going to turn it back over to Homa for one more of our quick questions, and then I think we're going to open it up we'll have about 10 minutes or so for us to chat.
Yeah, and we just want to highlight the question, are we okay? Because wellness certainly has risen to the surface, not only our physical wellness, which is what all our COVID protocols are about, but also social, emotional, mental health. And so this is an example of the kind of audits that we're doing. You can try to run as a result of downloading the book, and that we are facilitating. And what we find is, first, figure out the what structures, practices, and expectations stand in the way of physical as well as social emotional well-being for both students as well as the adults in your community. So first, you need to kind of go slow to go fast. You need to identify what before you go to so what, what do all those structures, what do all those blockages mean to us? And then now what? So what, now what? So then after you've had a chance to identify, consider the implications, then plan around. And so you can see we have a link from, we do this with groups all the time. And it's remarkable. These are simple questions, but rarely do professionals, do educators have a chance to sit down and really do some meaningful reflection to figure out how to move forward. And so we offer this to you in hopes that you might get something out of it. Consider, what is your island of sanity? Who's on it? What can you do to maintain that island of sanity and to move forward with hope? And as Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. It is a commitment to the future that must manifest action. So we hope that you will be able to move forward with that commitment and manifest it in action. We're very easy to reach, and we hope that you'll, reach out and even, inquire about ways that we might be able to be of any service to your school, your district. There's a community Big Questions Institute that you can join. There's no cost. We try to give a lot away, and to just be part of a conversation, and it is with educators from around the world. So Paul, if it's okay, let's just open it up for a few minutes and see if anyone has any thoughts, questions, pushback, contribution, anything at all. We'd love to hear from you.
There's a lot to take in here. So there's 9 questions themselves that were presented just in the presentation, right? So feel free to just ask anything on your mind. This is very like 30,000 foot view level that I have always found is really important for educators to be able to be in that type of conversation that they don't often get to be in, right? Because you're grinding all day in the weeds of the work. Yeah. So this is a space where it would just be great to have as many voices as possible.
There are a lot of ways to turn this into practicality. There's a question about how similarities and differences with Montessori education. We've worked with a variety of, from Reggio Emilia to International Baccalaureate, all kinds of systems, and it's really a matter of how you apply it. And I think the Montessori educators can make a lot of connection. We want to really center joy, wonder, doing, global citizenship. Those are all pieces, and that's one of the beauties of inquiry, I think, is that you can take inquiry and apply it to many different models.
I think too, just briefly, Montessori and Reggio, this is a moment for those approaches, I think, because they are helping kids develop as inquisitive, curious, connected learners who will learn their way through the world. And that's really where we need to be right now. So Paige, in response to that question, there's been a lot of concern, and I think probably, absolutely well documented and real about the impacts of the pandemic, the impacts of not being in school. I'm not sure about, I think emotionally, the research is showing that kids need to be with other kids. They need to be in social settings, and there is going to be an impact on these kids in this generation. There's no question about that. Academically, I'm not so sure. I think that in many cases we have some expectations of kids that maybe aren't aligned with the way that all kids develop naturally. And I think that kids can catch up academically. I think, again, the question goes back to what Homa said, was there learning loss or was there schooling loss? And in many cases, I think kids learned, they were continuing to learn, but it may not have been what was in the curriculum. And so that's kind of the challenge there. Seamus?
Yeah, thanks. I like to talk like a human. So, I think it was Homa said something that was really impactful to me. You said our brains were not built for that much or uncertainty, and it really struck me because I'm thinking a lot of the stuff I tell my students is, you find happiness. Happiness is really the delta between expectations and then what happens in reality, right? And if those two things are super different, we get anxiety, we get depression. That's what I've always been taught, and that's what I've always experienced. But if we don't even know what to expect, then it's like dividing by zero. It's like the computer system, our computer system breaks down and says it doesn't work. So I think that's where we're at. I don't know. I just wanted to add that really struck me and made me think a lot.
I think, and I think one way to help navigate through it is sort of like facing our fears and talking about hard things and not avoiding those. Talking about all the uncertainty, talking about our brains weren't built for this much uncertainty, recognizing it, making it visible, and people will feel less alone and help each other. That's part of the island of sanity, to have each other's back and be there for each other, because we're all going through this. You don't have to go through it on your own. And it's a global challenge that I do believe that humans got us into this mess. Humans can get us out of it. I really do have a lot of faith in humans. And so isn't that kind of the business that we're in? And I think it's very practical. I think this is more about the jobs of the present and the future. Some people will say, well, this isn't very practical. And it's like, actually, this is what's practical. I think of a lot of the skills that the jobs of the present and the future need. You can think of them. Some people say soft skills. I don't call them soft skills. I call them core skills. So empathy, collaboration, creativity. How is that not a core skill for the jobs of the present and the future? Candy, you have your hand up?
Candy, just unmute yourself.
Or maybe that was an accidental hand raise.
Well, we probably have time for one or two more questions if anyone wants to just jump in.
I have a question. So one thing that really struck me in this conversation, given the experience you guys have of talking with so many people from around the world, what has the impact been on these conversations in terms of bridge building within the institution known as education, as well as the community? So a lot of times we have these narratives of teachers always feel like they're getting maybe can't go ask their principal for something. Principals feel like they can't go ask their superintendents for something. Superintendents feel like they can't go ask their boards for something. Like they're all agreeing on the same things, but they feel like there's pressures coming from all these places. What have your conversations done in terms of like building those bridges of conversation?
Well, Paul, we actually been doing a lot of work with a group up in Quebec, and we actually held like 19 conversations with groups from around the province. And in almost all of those, this sense of powerlessness came up, the sense that these are great ideas, but, we have to wait for the ministry, or we have to wait for someone else to give us permission or whatever else. But we always asked in that moment, are there any places in the province where really interesting learning is happening, where kids are, doing things that have meaning in the world, solving problems, all that kind of stuff. And invariably, everybody says, oh yeah, there's stuff like that happening, And so I guess it comes back to, if we can engage people in developing a different story, a different narrative of what the education experience looks like. And if we can coherently describe what our aspirational story is, that's a great starting point for people to come together and work toward that goal, even if it means very small, concrete steps in the interim. And I think the more that we can at least agree upon or commit to a certain vision of education, I think it's easier then to begin to build toward that, to design toward that. And I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I think that that's where a lot of these conversations really grow root and become a little bit more sustainable, because there's this kind of shared sense of commitment to an ideal.
We also find that to try to instill lasting and substantive change invites students to the table.
Absolutely.
One of our questions is who is unheard? And so much decision making has happened in very exclusionary, exclusive environments. And so bringing in students, noticing, are the people at the table making these decisions reflective of the community that we serve? And if not, we need to address that difference, that gap. So it's sort of like a secret sauce when students are at the table. What we learn from them, the perspectives, the reality check that they bring.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I think they just get it. You can talk about something for 8 hours with adults, but it takes 15 minutes with kids and they're like, okay, let's move on. Let's start creating. And that's one of the things I've always enjoyed about having young folks at tables with this kind of stuff. Now, Will, I know you have a hard stop and you've already generously given us more than 3 minutes over. So Homa, I don't know what your time looks like. You're more than welcome to stay on if other folks have questions. I'm good to stay on until everyone leaves. So Will and Homa, first and foremost, just a formal thank you. And thank you to everyone who's shown up tonight to listen to this presentation and all this great conversation. If you as a participant need to leave too, feel free to hop off. But otherwise, I'm happy to stay on here and keep the conversation going if folks want to stay.
Appreciate it, Paul, and apologies that I have to leave, but I do have a commitment I have to make. So thanks everyone for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. Hope you felt that was a good spend of 45 minutes at least. And sincere best wishes on your work moving forward. This is an important time for educators to have these conversations. So cheers.
And Paul, I can stay on for a couple minutes. I will tell you all, it's been, the Zoom space is kind of an amazing space. We started this morning at 6 a.m. Working with a school, an American school in Sri Lanka. It was, I think, 4:30 in the afternoon there. And so we started with that, and we've had this sort of journey around the world today. So it's pretty amazing, and people really want to engage in these conversations. We're seeing some real change that is beginning. At least just kind of planting seeds by having these conversations, asking the 9 questions. It's been an interesting journey. But does anyone else want to ask a question while I'm here?
Hi, I was wondering if you could share that document about sacred, and that I think that would be really good and helpful for the rest of my staff to look at.
Yes, so I just put a comment, the question about what is sacred and the sort of a little bit of the instructions, and you can also, show this recording, is in the free ebook. The first question in the book is what is sacred. So we frame the question, you can talk through, you can use it. The book is a very quick read. So if you wanted to have like a staff read or a book club sort of thing, it's like a book you could read in, I don't know, under like 2 hours for the whole thing. So you could just take that question, what is sacred, from the free download. I put it in the chat and just get it from there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, and good luck with it. I hope that you can work on that together. I see Tara and then Diana.
Hi. So I guess my question, obviously I want to read the book later, but I guess my question is, like, in identifying the sacred, like, we're running into a problem where kind of like the parents and what is sacred is different from what is sacred to like the school and the students. Like we really have, like we're running into like a kind of political divide and things like that. So kind of like which voice is most important in that, or how do you at least kind of deal with contradictory perspectives and all of that? Like with any recommendations?
Yeah, so we have done this with parent groups, and I have personally worked with some organizations and groups that are experiencing some really challenging sort of backlash to some of their efforts. And I think that, you know, there are a few things that, I mean, and we work like as we work alongside a number of school districts for the kind of rollout. So because we know it's complicated, like you can't just say, okay, magic wand, just do this. There's a lot you can do though. And so I said it once, I think tonight, you need to go slow to go fast. You need to bring parents together and have a conversation. And I think parents need to feel seen and heard because they have been under incredible stress. And if it seems like we are just as teachers, as schools, sort of piling on more for them to do, you know, the thing, our brains weren't built for this much uncertainty, they start to snap. So I think taking time, if you get some backlash for whatever it might be from particular parents, taking time to listen to them, for them to feel seen and heard is really important, not with you having a predetermined answer before they start talking, but to take that time based on your shared interest that you all want what's best for their child. Having a group meeting to that might be launched with a shared, like we put it on a Padlet, we create an empty Padlet and we ask this question, what is sacred? If you were to come back to your school in 10 or 20 years, what would you hope still remains here? What matters the most about our children's education and our school? Let them come out with the answers. I almost will guarantee that none of them will say like the test score. None of them will say the curriculum. They don't. Like we've done this hundreds of times. So you do need someone who can kind of facilitate that conversation from your end, but let them come out with what is sacred. And then look at, it's almost like a story emerges from that Padlet, a story of what is sacred. And you will share, that is a shared understanding you build together. And those become sort of hopes and dreams that you want to plan against. So you're going to hear people say relationships, connection, joy, belonging, empathy. So how do you show that? How do you tell the parents that's our shared goal? That's what we want to get to. And I find, like, we have seen some really great breakthroughs. It's not that it won't be challenging, but it does take like a process of walking them through. And I think building on a shared sense of what is sacred in our school community it's actually very unifying. Diana?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question.
Hi, I have a question in terms of working with predominantly Black families and predominantly Black schools. What's your experience been with this process?
My experience has been really good. We also do, I mean, it's not nothing is a magic bullet. Our experience with the process, and I want to tell you, I also have a sister organization called the Oneness Lab. And so we bring a lot of that work together, onennesslab.com and bigquestions.institute. So for us, questions of equity, justice, belonging, inclusion, they're at the heart of every strategic question. They're at the heart of every question about learning. They're not separate items that, okay, we're going to take care of that, and then we'll look at these other points. So I think that oftentimes when the community is aware that that is the starting point, and that's the starting point on, I mean, maybe in your school, you can do a book reading with your community and just see what comes out, not having a predetermined agenda, but listening to what those experiences are, could be very powerful. And, we think, in terms of the questions, there are questions about where is the power, who is unheard. And we often talk about this idea, the West African proverb, that the lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. And so we want to hear the story, not only from the hunter, the victor who was in the dominant place, but also the lions. And we miss out if we don't get to hear the lion's story. So, so that's sort of an important frame for us to keep in mind. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, Diana.
It does. It goes a long way. You mentioned a book reading with the community. Would you have some recommendations for what that book might be?
Well, I'm saying download our free ebook,
Your
The
free
9 Big
book.
Questions.
Okay.
It's
All
free.
right.
The link is in the chat. Paul
Okay.
can maybe post it one more time. Because it's free, and because schools literally all over the world, like you could even partner with another school, or you could, just do this as for parents and teachers and students to think about, to sort of, it is a question of agency and shared power. We want to think about the future of education together. And we know that the system that we have now has really not served all of our children.
Exactly. And it's been
And so
exasperated by COVID. Well, thank you very much. I got some great ideas. Thank you.
And Diana, please be in touch and let us know how it goes. And if there's anything we can do to support your process, we would love to do that.
Thank you.
So there are still 20 folks on this call, which means you all are engaged and enjoying the conversation happening, but we've only heard from a small fraction. So if you have a question or a wondering or even commentary to provide that can be responded to, we definitely invite you.
Just staying for more insight, enjoying everyone's questions and stories. So thank you.
Thank you. I just appreciate the thoughtfulness and the engagement of this group. And, we really do mean it, like reach out to us, and we just want to support. I think you're doing the most important work in the world, and it is hard. It is so hard right now. So thank you for everything you're doing, and love to, be in touch. And thank you so much, Paul.